There is a man in Seoul that even governments are afraid to name out loud. And there is a little girl who looked at him, this monster wrapped in $1,000 suit, and called him Daddy. What happened next will break you, then put you back together. This is the story of a child who saw through the darkest armor in Korea, of a woman who had everything stolen from her and still refused to break, and of a man who thought he had buried every soft thing inside himself, until a 2-year-old proved him wrong. Stay with me until the end. Hit that like button. And drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The call came at 6:47 in the morning, and Amara Brooks knew before she even answered that her day was already dead. She was standing in her kitchen in the dark, one hand pressed flat on the counter, the other holding a travel mug of coffee she hadn't touched yet. Nia was still asleep. The apartment in Mapogu was quiet in the specific way Seoul mornings could be. Not peaceful exactly, just suspended, the city holding its breath before the chaos started. Amara had been up since 5. She'd ironed her blouse twice. She'd run the numbers in her head so many times they felt like a heartbeat by now. Revenue projections, quarterly variance, the slides she'd spent 11 days building from scratch. Today was the most important day of her professional life. She knew that the way she knew her own name. And then the phone lit up. It was Mrs. Cho from the Sunflower Daycare Center on Yeonam-dong, the woman who smelled like green tea and always called Nia our little sunshine. Mrs. Cho, who had never in 14 months called Amara before 8 in the morning. Ms. Brooks. Her voice was tight, the way people's voices get when they're delivering news they don't want to deliver. I'm so sorry to call at this hour. Amara set down the mug. What happened? There has been an issue, a health inspection, mandatory closure. They're saying at least 3 days, perhaps the whole week. A pause. I'm so sorry. I know today is no. The word came out flat. Not panicked, not yet. Just flat, like a door closing. No, that's... Okay, thank you, Mrs. Cho. She hung up. For exactly 4 seconds, she stood completely still in her dark kitchen, in her ironed blouse with her cold coffee, and she looked at the wall and did not move. Then she started making calls. Her neighbor, Ji Young, who watched Nia sometimes, in Japan for a conference, wouldn't be back until Thursday. Her co-worker, Priya, who had offered once to help. Her own kid had a fever. She'd answered the phone whispering, sounded miserable, already apologizing before Amar could even finish the sentence. Her friend Sue Bin from the expat group. No answer. A voicemail. Then another voicemail. Then a text that bounced back unread. By 7:15, she had called 9 people. By 7:30, she was standing in Nia's doorway watching her daughter sleep. Nia was 2 years and 4 months old. She slept on her stomach with her arms out like she was trying to fly somewhere, face turned to the side, one small fist pressed against her cheek. She had Amara's mouth, that same stubborn set to the lips even in sleep, and big dark eyes she hadn't gotten from anyone Amara could name, though she'd stopped wondering about that years ago. Or told herself she had. Nia made small sounds when she slept, not quite words, just sounds, like she was narrating something important in a language only she understood. Amara looked at her for a long moment. Then she went to get the diaper bag. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself she would find somewhere for Nia to wait. The lobby, maybe, the reception area. She'd figure it out when she got there. KTH Capital was one of the largest holding companies in Korea. 12 floors, 300 employees, a lobby the size of a small airport. Surely, somewhere in that building, there was a quiet corner where a toddler could sit with some crackers and a tablet for 2 hours, while her mother did the single most important presentation of her 7-year career. She told herself all of this while she was buckling Nia into the stroller, while she was folding her laptop bag over her shoulder, while she was locking the apartment door behind her with the diaper bag catching on the door frame, and Nia already asking, "Where going, Mama? Where going, Mama?" In that relentless loop the way 2-year-olds do, the question that doesn't stop until you answer it, and then just starts again. "Work, baby," Amara said. "Mama's going to work." "Mama work," Nia repeated, satisfied. "Yeah." She pulled the strap free. "Mama's going to work." The taxi ride took 22 minutes. Nia ate a rice cake and dropped half of it on the seat, and Amara apologized to the driver in Korean, and he waved her off like it was nothing. Outside the window, Seoul moved past. The river bridges, the towers going silver in the early light, the construction cranes that were always there no matter what part of the city you were in, always building, always adding another floor to something. Amara watched it go by and ran her numbers again in her head, and didn't let herself think about what would happen if today didn't go the way it needed to. She didn't let herself think about that. KTH Capital Tower stood at the edge of Yeongdeungpo like it had always been there, like it had grown up out of the bedrock fully formed. 53 floors of black glass and steel, no flourishes, no decorative anything. Just height and weight and the particular stillness that comes from a building that has never once needed to justify itself to anyone. The lobby doors were heavy enough that Amara had to lean her full weight into them. Inside, everything was marble and silence, and the soft sound of a fountain somewhere that you couldn't see. Amara had been working here for 8 months. She was a mid-level financial analyst, technically employed by KTH's Seoul branch under the VP of Corporate Strategy. She had fought for this job the way you fight for something when you understand that not getting it isn't an option. Years of credentials, 2 languages, a master's degree from a program that cost more than her parents' house, nights she'd rather not count. She was one of 2 foreign analysts in the entire building. She was good at her job. She knew she was good at her job. None of that felt like very much right now, standing in the lobby of KTH Capital Tower with a toddler in a stroller and a diaper bag on her shoulder and a presentation due in 90 minutes. Ms. Brooks, the man at the front desk, was Ji Hwan, who had checked her badge every morning for 8 months and had exactly once asked about her weekend. He looked at Nia with the particular expression of someone who has been trained to never look surprised but cannot quite pull it off. "Hi," Amara smiled, the smile she wore when things were bad. "Small emergency. Any chance? Is there a conference room not in use? Ground floor, somewhere out of the way? Just for a couple hours." Ji Hwan's eyes went to Nia and back to Amara. "The 9th floor executive suites are all in use," he said slowly. "I don't think I can—" "Ground floor," Amara said. "Storage room, a broom closet. I'm not picky." He looked deeply uncomfortable. "Ms. Brooks, I don't think—" "Ji Hwan." She kept her voice level. She was very, very good at keeping her voice level. "I have a presentation in 90 minutes for Director Yoon that I have been preparing for 11 days. My daycare had a mandatory closure this morning. I have called every person I know in this city. I just need 2 hours in a small space where she won't bother anyone." He looked at Nia again. Nia was looking at the fountain she still couldn't see, leaning forward in her stroller with her neck craned, utterly unconcerned with the negotiation happening above her head. Ji Hwan said, "I can try to reach Ms. Bayek in HR." "Thank you," Amara said, "because sometimes you have to take the maybe and run." Ms. Bayek in HR was a woman in her 40s with reading glasses pushed up on her head and the energy of someone who had survived enough corporate restructurings to be unfazed by virtually anything. She came down to the lobby, looked at Nia for a long moment, and then looked at Amara. "Director Yoon's presentation is at 10, she said. "I know. The executive floor has a no-visitor policy." "I know. Children especially." "I know, Ms. Baek." A pause. Ms. Bayek looked at Nia again. Nia had found a leaf somewhere, from where Amara couldn't begin to guess, and was examining it with the gravity of a scientist. "There is a small meeting room on the 2nd floor, Ms. Baek said, "used for overflow sometimes. It should be empty until 11. Another pause. "You didn't hear this from me." "Hear what?" Amara said. Ms. Baek almost smiled. The 2nd floor room was small, yes. A table, 4 chairs, a whiteboard with some old writing still on it, a window that looked out at the side of another building. Amara set up the tablet, organized the crackers, the juice box, the small stuffed rabbit that Nia called Bun Bun, and which was honestly falling apart, the spare clothes just in case, the wipes, the small emergency kit she had learned to carry everywhere because children at 2 years old are chaos with legs. She got Nia settled with the tablet and a cartoon about a small bear who goes on adventures, a show Nia had watched so many times she could narrate it herself, and crouched down in front of the stroller. "Okay," she said. "Mama needs to go upstairs for a little while. You're going to stay here and watch your show and be very, very quiet. Can you do that?" Nia was already looking at the tablet. "Bear," she said. "Yes, baby, the bear. Can you be quiet?" "Bear," Nia confirmed. Amara pressed a kiss to her daughter's forehead, straightened up, checked that her blouse was still straight, picked up her laptop bag, and walked out. She had 81 minutes. She used them. The presentation went well. That is to say, it went exactly the way a presentation goes when the person giving it has been over every number so many times they could recite them backward, in the dark. Director Yoon was a careful man, the kind who never nodded when he was listening to you and saved all his reactions for afterward, which made presenting to him feel like shouting into a very expensive void. But he asked the right questions. His team asked sharp questions. Amara answered every one of them without hesitation, moved through the slides at the right pace, hit the projections from 3 different angles the way she'd planned. And by the time she was done, there were a few senior analysts in the back of the room who were looking at each other in the way people do when someone has done something better than expected. Afterward, in the hallway, Director Yoon's assistant told her quietly that he was satisfied with the work. High praise. The highest she was likely to get. She walked back to the elevator with her laptop bag and allowed herself exactly 10 seconds of relief. And then she pressed the button for the second floor and told herself the hardest part was over. She heard it before the elevator doors opened. The sound that a toddler makes when they have been patient for a long time and have now exhausted every molecule of patience they possess, and have decided that the way forward is volume. Not crying, exactly. Nia wasn't a crier, not usually, but something close to it. That escalating sound that starts as a complaint and becomes a declaration and then becomes something you can feel in your molars. Amara moved fast. She pushed through the door of the small meeting room. It was empty. The tablet was on the table, the cartoon still running, the juice box, the crackers, Bun. Everything was there. Nia was not. For one terrible second, Amara stood in the doorway of the empty room and felt the world drop out from under her. Then she heard it. Down the hall, louder. She ran. The corridor on the second floor connected to a service stairwell, and the stairwell connected to the executive elevator bank, the one that bypassed regular floors and went straight to the upper levels. The elevator doors were just closing when Amara got there, and through the narrowing gap, she saw the back of a tiny head, dark curls, her daughter's exact height, and the edge of Bun's floppy ear. Nia! She lunged for the door. Too late. The doors closed. She hit the button. She watched the numbers count up. Second. Third. She hit the button again. Irrational, like that would help. The numbers kept climbing. She looked at them. 47. 48. 49. The elevator wasn't stopping until the executive floor. The 49th floor was where Kang Tae-hyun worked. Everyone in the building knew which floor that was. The same way everyone in Seoul who knew anything knew which name not to say too loudly in the wrong company. KTH Capital's legitimate face was corporate investment, real estate development, pharmaceutical holdings, 3 tech startups that had gone public in the last 2 years. Clean, well-documented, impressive. But KTH's other face, the one that everyone who worked here knew existed and no one ever mentioned, was the reason the executive floor had its own security team, its own air filtration system, its own protocols that existed nowhere in the employee handbook. Kang Tae-hyun was 38 years old and had run this empire since he was 26. He had survived 2 assassination attempts, a cancer diagnosis at 33 that had put him in a German hospital for 6 months, and a government investigation that had quietly dissolved without charges in a way that told you more than any verdict could. He was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most powerful and most dangerous men in Korea, and Amara's 2-year-old daughter had just ridden the elevator to his floor alone. She took the stairs. She had never been to the 49th floor. There was no reason, in 8 months of working here, that she would have been. The stairwell door on 49 was heavier than the others. She noticed that as she pushed through it, gasping, having taken 47 flights of stairs in the kind of heels she would never again wear on a day she might need to run. And then she was in the corridor and she could already hear it. The sound had changed. It had gone quiet. That was somehow worse. The executive floor of KTH Capital was different from the rest of the building. The floors were darker, the lighting lower, the air carrying the faint smell of expensive paper and something metallic she couldn't identify. There were no cubicles, no open plan anything, just doors and the space between them, and at the far end a set of glass-paneled double doors that were partially open. From inside those doors, she heard nothing. She walked toward them with her heart somewhere in her throat. She pushed the door open. The office was enormous. Floor-to-ceiling windows that ran the entire length of the far wall, Seoul spread out below like something assembled from light and mathematics. A desk that probably cost more than Amara's car back in the States. Bookshelves on the left side of the room, actual books, not decorative ones. Worn spines and post-it tabs sticking out at angles. A long conference table. A sitting area with chairs that cost what they cost. And in the center of the room, Kang Tae-hyun. She recognized him from the company's official photographs, though those photographs had not quite prepared her for the reality of the man. He was taller than she'd expected. Or maybe it was the room, or maybe it was the way he held himself. The particular stillness of someone who has never in their life needed to make themselves bigger to take up space, because the space was already theirs. Dark suit. No tie today. His face was the kind of face that didn't offer you anything it hadn't already decided to give. He was crouching down. On the floor in front of him, Nia sat with Bunbun pressed against her chest, looking up at him with the complete, unself-conscious curiosity of a child who has not yet learned that some people are supposed to be frightening. Around the room, 5 men stood frozen. Security, from the look of them, 2 with hands still moving toward jackets and now stopped. Uncertain, the way people get uncertain when the situation doesn't match any protocol they've been given. No one was moving. Taehyun's security detail was not moving because their boss was crouching in front of a toddler and they didn't know what to do with that. The toddler was not moving because she had found something more interesting than moving. The man in front of her, who was looking at her the way people sometimes looked at things they couldn't explain. And then Nia did what Nia did. She reached out both arms. The way she reached for Amara when she wanted to be picked up. The uncomplicated, absolute reach of a child who has no reason to believe the answer will be no. And she said clearly, in the silence of the most powerful man in Korea's private office, with 5 armed security personnel watching, and Amara standing in the doorway with 47 floors of stairs still burning in her legs. "Daddy?" The word landed in the room like something dropped from a great height. Taehyun went very still. It wasn't the stillness he'd walked in wearing, that controlled, practiced stillness of someone who doesn't react because reacting is a form of vulnerability. This was something different. This was the stillness of a man who has been hit somewhere he didn't know he could be hit. He looked at the child for a long moment. He looked at her. Amara couldn't see his face from where she was standing, only the line of his shoulders, the way one hand had come up slightly from his side and then stopped, not quite reaching, not quite pulling back. Then he looked up. He looked directly at Amara. She thought, in the fraction of a second before her professional instincts slammed down over everything else, that his eyes looked like someone had just turned a light on in a room that hadn't been opened in a very long time. Startled. Unguarded. Almost, something she didn't have a word for. Then it was gone. His expression went smooth and controlled and unreadable, and he straightened up slowly, and the silence in the room became a different kind of silence, the kind with weight to it. One of the security men started moving toward Nia with the intention, clearly, of removing the intruder from the executive floor, and Amara crossed the room in 4 strides and scooped her daughter up and held her like a thing she'd been afraid to lose, which was exactly what Nia was. "I'm so sorry," she said. Her voice was steady. It shouldn't have been, but it was that old discipline kicking in, the one she'd developed over years of being the only person in the room who looked like her, of knowing that certain kinds of falling apart had costs she couldn't afford. "She was in a room on the 2nd floor. She must have gotten out. I'm sorry. I will take her out immediately." The room was still very quiet. Taehyun had not looked away from her. "You work here," he said. His English was exact, the accent precisely positioned somewhere between British and American, like someone who had learned the language from multiple sources and synthesized them. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir." Amara Brooks. Financial analysis, Director Yoon's team. A beat. "You brought a child to the executive floor." "My daycare had an emergency closure. I had nowhere else. I kept her on the 2nd floor during my presentation. She must have found her way to the elevator. I don't know how she stopped herself. Apologizing in fragments wasn't going to help anything. "I'm sorry. It won't happen again." Nia, oblivious to all of this, had twisted in Amara's arms to look back at the man she'd just called Daddy, and was watching him with that same placid, evaluating look that small children and very old people sometimes had in common. The look of someone who is not yet convinced that the world has given them the full story. Taehyun looked at the child again. Something moved across his face, too fast to catch. "What is her name?" he said. Amara hesitated for just a fraction of a second. "Nia." He said it to himself, almost. Not to Amara, just the word, trying the shape of it. Naya. Nia, on cue, said, "Daddy," again, as if she were introducing herself by proxy. Amara wanted to evaporate. She wanted the floor of this expensive office to develop a fault line specifically for her. "She says that sometimes," she said, the explanation coming out thin and inadequate even as she said it. "To men, sometimes older men, she stopped. That was worse. She's 2. She doesn't. I'm very sorry." The security man closest to the door had taken another step forward, and Taehyun raised one hand, just the smallest gesture, and the man stopped. The room waited. Taehyun put his hands in his pockets. He looked at Nia one more time. The child was now attempting to feed Bun Bun an invisible something and had mostly moved on from the situation. And then he looked at Amara, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. "You had a presentation this morning," he said. She blinked. "Yes." "For Director Yoon?" "Yes." "Quarterly variance analysis. Infrastructure holdings, cross-sector." He said it like he was confirming something he already knew, like he'd already read it. "Yoon said it was the most thorough analysis his team has produced this year." Amara stood very still. "I've been looking for a new executive assistant," Taehyun said. He said it the way he might say anything. Without embellishment, without warmth, without a change in his expression. Just information, delivered. Someone with financial background, analytical capacity, someone who can handle complexity without losing precision. The silence stretched. "Are you offering me a job?" Amara said. The question came out with more edge than she intended, more disbelief. "I'm offering you a position," he said. "It's not the same thing." A pause. "The salary is 3 times your current compensation. The work is different in nature. The expectations are significant." She looked at him. She looked at the room. She looked at the 5 security men who were all watching this exchange with varying degrees of barely concealed confusion. "I don't understand what's happening right now," she said. "That's all right." He turned back toward his desk, which she understood was a dismissal. "Think about it. Tell Director Yoon's office by end of day." He sat down, opened something on his desk, seemed to have finished the conversation. Amara stood there for another 2 seconds holding her daughter. Nia waved at the back of his head. He didn't look up. But, and Amara wasn't sure about this, couldn't be sure, the angle was wrong and she was still running on adrenaline and the particular disorientation of the last 90 minutes. She thought she saw in the faint reflection of the window glass in front of him the very edge of something happening in his face. She carried Naya out of the office and back to the elevator and didn't say a word for the entire ride down. On the ground floor in the marble lobby with the invisible fountain, she sat down on a bench and let Nia climb into her lap and breathed for a moment. "Daddy?" Nia said contentedly, patting Amara's knee. "No," Amara said, though she didn't know what she was saying no to. She sat there with her daughter's weight in her lap and tried to understand what had just happened on the 49th floor, and the longer she sat there, the more she understood only this. Something had shifted in a room she hadn't known she was standing in, and Kang Tae-hyun, the man the city didn't name too loudly, had looked at her daughter with an expression she hadn't been able to name. That was the part that stayed with her. That was the part she couldn't put down. She pulled out her phone. She looked at Director Yoon's office number in her contacts for a long moment. Then she looked at Nia, who was explaining something to Bun Bun in the serious, fragmented language of toddlers. Something about bears and daddy and going up, telling the rabbit a story about the morning the way children do, without hierarchy or drama, just the facts as she understood them. Amara put the phone back in her pocket. She needed to think. Because the thing no one told you about a man like Kang Tae-hyun, the thing she'd seen for 3 seconds in his eyes before the shutters came down, was that whatever he was behind all of it, whatever was underneath the empire and the silence and the reputation that made other powerful men nervous, it was real. She just didn't know yet what it was. And somewhere above her on the 49th floor, in an office full of Seoul's morning light, a man sat at a desk and did not look at the file his assistant had just placed beside his keyboard, but his hand rested near it, and he did not move it away. She made the call to Director Yoon's office at 4:53 p.m. She said yes. She would spend the next 3 months wondering why, and then she would find out. The first week, she told herself it was just a job. She said it in the mornings while she was getting Nia dressed, while she was packing the diaper bag with the new daycare information, a different center, further from the apartment, but with longer hours and a waiting list she'd somehow gotten to the top of in 48 hours, which she suspected had nothing to do with luck and everything to do with the name on her new employment paperwork. She said it on the elevator ride up to 49, standing straight in the corner with her laptop bag and her coffee and the particular face she wore when she needed the world to believe she was more certain than she was. She said it while she was learning the rhythms of the floor, which assistants to go through for what, which calendar requests needed immediate escalation, which calls he took standing up, and which ones he ended in under 40 seconds. Just a job. She almost believed it. Kang Tae-hyun was not what she'd expected, which was its own problem, because she had constructed expectations specifically so she wouldn't be caught off guard. She'd done her research, the careful, sourced kind, cross-referencing what was publicly documented about KTH Capital against what could be inferred from adjacent information, financial filings, court records from cases that had been withdrawn, press coverage that was notable more for what it didn't say than what it did. She knew the shape of the man from the outside. She thought she knew what she was walking into. She did not know what she was walking into. The first time she understood this was a Tuesday in her second week, early morning, the floor nearly empty. She'd come in at 6:30 because there was a set of documents that needed reviewing before a 9 o'clock call with a Singapore-based firm, and she was working at the desk outside his office when the door opened and he walked out already in his jacket, which meant he'd been there before her, which meant he'd come in before 6:30, and she filed that away without reacting. He stopped when he saw her. Not in surprise. She didn't think he was a man who surprised easily, but in the way someone stops when they've recalculated something. "You're early," he said. The Singapore documents needed another pass. There were 3 translation inconsistencies in the revenue section that would have caused problems on the call. A pause. He looked at her for a moment, the way he looked at things. Not expressionless exactly, more like he was running some internal assessment that he had no intention of sharing. Then he walked past her toward the kitchen alcove at the end of the corridor. "Coffee," he said, which she understood was not a request for her to make it, but an explanation of where he was going. She went back to the documents. 20 minutes later, he set a cup of coffee on the corner of her desk without a word and kept walking. She looked at it. Then she looked at his retreating back. Then she looked at the coffee again. She picked it up. It was exactly the way she drank it. She had not told anyone on this floor how she drank her coffee. She told herself it meant nothing. He was meticulous about everything. He probably cataloged how everyone in his orbit took their coffee the same way he tracked interest rates and board member vulnerabilities. It was information. He collected information the way other men collected certainties. That was what she told herself. But she held the cup with both hands for a moment before she drank. And she was honest enough, alone at 6:50 in the morning, with Seoul going gray-blue outside the windows, to notice the warmth of it. The work itself was unlike anything she'd done before. It wasn't that it was harder, exactly. It was that it was denser, more layered, the way a river looks calm on the surface and has 3 different currents running underneath. She was reviewing financial structures that connected legitimate holdings to entities she couldn't fully map, drafting communications that had to be precise in ways that had nothing to do with grammar and everything to do with what was left unsaid. She was sitting in meetings where men twice her age and infinitely more dangerous said things in Korean they assumed she wouldn't catch, and watching Taehyun's face in her peripheral vision to see if he noticed that she had. He noticed. He said nothing about it until the 3rd week, after a meeting with a man named Park Dae-sung, who ran a logistics company that was, based on what Amara had assembled from available data, a useful piece of fiction. After Park left and the room had emptied, Taehyun sat at the head of the conference table looking at the door for a moment. "Your Korean is better than you let them think," he said. She didn't insult him by pretending otherwise. "It's useful to let people underestimate your comprehension." He looked at her then. A different look than she was used to from him. Something that might have been, on a different man's face, appreciation. "Yes," he said. "It is." He picked up his folder and left. She sat at the table for a moment after, told herself it meant nothing. The problem wasn't the job. The problem wasn't even him, exactly. It was the version of him she kept encountering that didn't match the file she'd built in her head. It was the way he remembered the names of assistants' children, not with warmth necessarily, but with precision. Asking Park Sua how her son's surgery had gone before a meeting, no preamble, no performative concern, just the question, direct, because he'd retained it and considered it relevant. It was the books. The shelves in his office were not decorative. She'd gotten close enough to read spines, medical texts alongside architecture, alongside game theory, alongside a Korean poetry collection that looked red to the edge of its binding. It was the hour she walked past his office at 7:15 one evening to find him on the floor, his jacket off, sitting cross-legged in front of his desk with papers spread around him in a pattern that looked like chaos but probably wasn't, working without any of the performance of power. None of this was in her file. None of this made anything easier. And underneath all of it, Nia had not forgotten. This was the part that Amara had hoped would resolve itself, that whatever strange impulse had led her daughter to look at a stranger and say, "Daddy," would dissolve in the ordinary way of toddler fixations, replaced by a new obsession, a new word, a new thing that commanded her complete and temporary devotion. 2-year-olds had the attention spans of mayflies. She'd been certain it would pass. It did not pass. Twice in the first month, Amara had brought Nia to the building on a Saturday morning when she needed to access a file she couldn't pull from home. Quick visits, 20 minutes. She'd intended to keep Nia in the lobby both times. Both times she had not managed this. The first time, Nia had spotted the executive elevator and made her intentions immediately clear with the volume and conviction that toddlers deployed in lieu of argument. The second time, Amara had just let her. She wasn't entirely sure why. She told herself it was easier than the alternative. Tae-hyun had been in his office both times, on a Saturday. Both times when Nia walked through the door, not ran, walked, with a dignity that Amara found both infuriating and heartbreaking. Tae-hyun had stopped what he was doing. The second Saturday, he was on a call, a serious one, from the sound of the Korean coming through the closed door, and his assistant Ha-jun had started to intercept with the expression of a man preparing to apologize for something he didn't want to apologize for. And then the door had opened, and Tae-hyun had looked at Ha-jun, and then at Naya, and then had said something into his phone that Amar's Korean caught as, roughly, "I'll call you back," and ended the call. Ha-jun looked like he'd witnessed a natural disaster. Tae-hyun crouched down to Nia's level. He had a way of doing this, not awkward, not performatively sweet, just direct, meeting her where she was without condescension. "You're back," he said. Nia held up Bun. "Bun's sick," she announced gravely. "What's wrong with him?" "Ear," Nia said. Bun's left ear was indeed hanging by what appeared to be hope and a single thread of original stitching. Tae-hyun looked at Bun's ear with complete seriousness. "We should fix that." "Fix," Naya agreed. Ha-jun caught Amara's eye across the corridor with the expression of a man who had worked for Kang Tae-hyun for 4 years and had just seen him voluntarily delay a call with one of their most volatile Singapore partners to assess a stuffed rabbit's medical situation. Amara looked away first. Later that afternoon, she found a small sewing kit on her desk. High quality, the kind with actual needles and thread in proper weights. No note. She sewed Bun's ear back on that evening with Nia providing medical supervision, and she did not think about where the kit had come from, and she thought about it the entire time. The problem with Jae-won was that he didn't announce himself. She'd known Choi Jae-won existed. He was in the organizational structure she'd been given, nominally the head of special operations, which was the kind of title that told you nothing and everything. He was 45, lean in the way of a man who had kept himself useful by staying dangerous, with a face that had been arranged by life into something permanently unimpressed. He'd been with Tae-hyun since before KTH Capital had its current name, which meant he'd been there for things that didn't appear in any document Amara had access to. He made his opinion of her clear on a Wednesday in her 5th week, in the elevator, without any particular aggression. which was almost worse than aggression would have been. "You're smart," he said, looking at the elevator doors. Not at her. At the doors. "Thank you," she said carefully. "I'm not complimenting you." He still wasn't looking at her. Smart people in this position are a problem when they get curious about the wrong things. She looked at the side of his face. "Is that a warning?" "It's an observation." "Then I'll observe," she said, keeping her voice as flat as his, "that I was hired to do a specific job, and I'm doing it. What I'm curious about in my own time is my own business." He looked at her then, direct, the look of someone taking a proper measurement. "Your little girl," he said. "She's in the Maple Leaf Center on Sinchon Row." Her whole body went cold. She did not let it show. "Yes. Pick up at 6. You're usually there by 5:50. He looked back at the doors. "I'm not threatening you. I want you to understand that I know things, the same way you're learning to know things." The elevator opened. That's all. He stepped out. She stood in the elevator for a moment after the doors tried to close and she had to put her hand out to stop them. She told herself she was not scared. She was scared. That evening she sat on the bathroom floor after Nia was asleep with her back against the tub and her phone in her hand and thought about calling someone. Her mother in Atlanta, who would tell her to come home. Her friend Keisha, who would ask the right questions and then tell her to come home. She thought about what she would say. "I work for a man who I'm increasingly certain runs something that the clean corporate structure is built on top of. His head of security just told me he knows my daughter's school pickup time, and I can't leave because why?" She sat with that. Because the work was real, and she was good at it, and she hadn't been good at something this demanding in a long time, and she'd forgotten how much that mattered. Because she was 3 months into a compensation package that had already let her move Nia to a better school and start paying back the loans that had been sitting on her like weather. Because she told herself those were the reasons, and they were true, and they were not all of the reasons. She put the phone away without calling anyone. She went to bed. She didn't sleep for a long time. The investigation, she found out later, had started the same week she accepted the job. She didn't know this yet on the Wednesday in her 7th week when she was working late and accidentally opened the wrong directory. It was a genuine accident. She'd been pulling the quarterly file for the Singapore meeting and clicked into a folder one level above where she'd intended, a folder labeled with a series of numbers that looked like a date code, the kind of filing system that her predecessor had apparently used for things that didn't have obvious categories. She was going to click out immediately. She was. And then she saw the file name. Her full legal name. Brooks. Amara Denise. Below it, NB. Genetic cross-reference. Fertility clinic records. Match probability, 99.7%. She sat very still. The office was empty. Hajun had left at 8. The floor was quiet with the specific quality of a place designed to absorb sound. She looked at the file name for a moment. Then she clicked on it. The folder contained 12 documents. She opened them in order. The first 3 were background files on her. Employment history, the kind of comprehensive record you could put together with the right resources and enough time. Nothing in it that was wrong, which was almost more unsettling than if it had been. The 4th document was from a medical records firm in Germany. The 5th was a laboratory report from a fertility clinic. She recognized the name, the Hanover Institute, because she had been there 4 years ago when she was 29 and single and making a decision she'd thought through for 2 years and discussed with her doctor and her mother and ultimately made alone in the specific way that felt like the most adult thing she'd ever done. Anonymous donor program. That was what she'd used. Anonymous. She'd asked 3 times, confirmed in writing, kept the documentation. Anonymous. She opened the 6th document. It was a DNA comparison. 2 profiles, one labeled Subject A, one labeled NB, female, DOB, Nia's birthday. Subject A's profile was extensive, annotated, cross-referenced with a medical history she read in fragments. A cancer diagnosis, treatment, stored genetic material prior to chemotherapy, a clinic in Frankfurt that had a transfer partnership with the Hanover Institute. A name appeared once, in a header she had to scroll to find, and it was there in a font no larger than anything else on the page. Just information, just a fact among facts. Kang Tai-hyun. Amara sat in the empty office on the 49th floor of KTH Capitol Tower, with the city spread out below her through floor-to-ceiling windows, and she read the name, and then she read it again, and the room did not change and the city did not change, and she sat there with her hands on the keyboard and felt something very old and very deep inside her begin to crack apart. She closed the folder. Her hands were steady. She noted this the way you note strange things when your mind is trying to protect itself. The specific steadiness of her hands on the keyboard, the way her breathing had gone shallow, but even the fact that the screensaver had not yet activated, which meant she had been sitting here for less than 3 minutes when it felt like something measured in geological time. She closed the folder, closed the directory, navigated back to the quarterly file she'd originally been looking for, found it, extracted the numbers she needed, documented them in the format the Singapore meeting required. Then she shut her laptop, picked up her bag, and walked to the elevator. She wrote it down 49 floors without moving. In the lobby, Ji-hwan said goodnight. She said goodnight back. Outside, the Seoul night was cool and smelled like rain that hadn't arrived yet, and she stood on the sidewalk for a moment with her laptop bag and the weight of what she'd just read sitting on her sternum, like something with mass. She picked up Nia 40 minutes before closing. The teacher at the front desk looked surprised. Amara was never this early. She said nothing, just signed the sheet and took her daughter and buckled her into the taxi and held her hand the entire ride home with a grip that was slightly too tight until Nia looked up at her and said, "Mama?" with the specific concern of a child who can feel something wrong without having words for it. "I'm okay, baby," Amar said. "Mama's okay." She was not okay. She gave Naya dinner and a bath and read her 2 books and stayed in the room until she was completely asleep. And then she sat at the kitchen table in the dark and dismantled what she thought she knew and tried to rebuild it with the new information. The Hanover Institute. Anonymous donor. She had documentation. She had signed documentation, in German and English, guaranteeing anonymity. What that documentation had not accounted for, what she had had no reason to account for, was a man with the resources of Kang Tae-hyun discovering that his stored genetic material had been used and using those same resources to find out where it had gone. He would have needed access to clinic records that were not supposed to be accessible. He would have needed to already know something, a tip, a thread, something that sent him looking. And then he would have needed someone very good at finding things that weren't meant to be found. 12 documents in that folder. 12. This had not been a recent decision. She sat at the table until 2 in the morning, and then she went to bed and lay on her back in the dark, looking at the ceiling, and made a decision. She went to work in the morning. She was at her desk by 7. She did her work. She answered the Singapore follow-up. She sat in on a restructuring call at 10 and took notes with the same precision she always brought to it. She did not go into the wrong directory. She did not look at him differently or try to. She looked at him the same way she always had, which was the look of a professional woman doing her job in a complex environment, guarded and competent and giving nothing away for free. She did this for 3 days. On the 4th day, he called her into his office at 6 in the evening when the floor was emptying out, and he said, "Close the door." And she did. And she sat in the chair across from his desk and looked at him and waited. He looked at her for a moment. Something in his posture was different, not softer. She didn't think that word applied to him, but less armored, like a small adjustment had been made to something structural. "You've been quiet," he said. "I'm always quiet. Differently quiet." She said nothing. He put his pen down on the desk. He didn't look away from her. "How long have you known?" The question arrived without any of the scaffolding she might have expected. No approach, no buffer, just the question, direct and without decoration. And she understood in that moment that he was not going to pretend, and he was not going to give her room to pretend either. 4 days, she said. He nodded once, as if confirming something. "You knew," she said. It wasn't a question, but it was. It was the question underneath everything. "Before you offered me the job, you already knew." Not with certainty. His voice was even, uninflected. "I had a probability." 99.7%, she said. That folder was open for 2 minutes and 40 seconds. Something moved across his face. Not guilt, exactly. Something more complicated than guilt. Yes. She looked at him. She held herself very still, and she looked at this man across his desk in his enormous office with Seoul burning orange in the windows behind him. and she felt the anger arrive. Not the hot kind, not the kind that came with volume and shaking, the cold kind, the kind that lived in the chest and had no interest in performing itself for anyone. "You brought me into your building," she said. "You promoted me to your personal staff. You put me in a position where I had access to sensitive information about your operations, where my continued employment depended on your goodwill, where I was, professionally and financially, dependent on decisions you made. And you did all of that knowing that my daughter might be your biological child." He said nothing. "You had a lawyer's amount of leverage over me, and you never disclosed any of this." Her voice stayed level. She needed it to stay level. "You've been in Nia's life. She calls you—" She stopped. Started again. "She's 2 years old. She's attached to you, and you let that happen while you were running an investigation into her DNA. I needed to know the truth before I—" "You needed," she said. The words came out quieter than she intended, which was somehow worse than if she'd raised her voice. "You needed, not what was right for her, not what was right for me. What you needed." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "That's accurate." She hadn't expected him to agree with her. She'd expected a defense. She'd been prepared for a defense. His agreement landed differently, not as a concession, but as something worse, something that sounded like honesty. And honesty from this man in this moment was almost harder to hold on to her anger against than if he'd argued. She stood up. "I'm resigning," she said. "I'll have something in writing to Ha-Jun tonight. I'll complete anything time-sensitive before I transition out. Amara." The first time he'd used her first name. In 7 weeks of working 6 feet from each other, it was the first time. She stopped. "I was 33, he said. He didn't move from behind the desk. His hands were flat on the surface of it. The diagnosis was aggressive. The treatment options were— the doctors were not optimistic. I stored material before I began chemotherapy because I was told it was reasonable precaution and I was in no position to think past the next 6 months. A pause. I didn't expect to survive. She didn't turn around. When I recovered, I didn't think about it again for 2 years. And then I thought about it because of something a doctor said during a follow-up examination, about the clinic, about a data irregularity they'd flagged internally. He paused again. I had resources. I used them. I found a probability, and then I found a certainty. And then I didn't know what to do with it. She turned then. He looked, for the first time in the 7 weeks she'd known him, like a man who was carrying something heavy and had been carrying it a long time and was not skilled at putting things down. You should have told me, she said. The anger was still there. It hadn't gone anywhere, but it had shifted slightly to accommodate something else, something she didn't have a clean name for. The moment you knew, you should have come to me. I know. Instead, you hired me. I didn't know how to— He stopped himself, started again, differently. I was afraid that if I came to you directly, before you knew me, before you had any reason to, that you would take her and disappear, and I would never— His jaw tightened. He looked at the desk. I would never have had a chance to know her. The room was very quiet. Outside, Seoul made its sounds, the city that never fully stopped. She's not yours to claim, Amar said, quiet but absolute. Whatever the DNA says. She doesn't know you as anything other than— She's 2. She doesn't know what she's saying when she calls you. She stopped because her voice had done something it wasn't supposed to do. She pulled it back, reset. I'm leaving, she said. She walked out. She made it to the elevator. She made it down 49 floors and through the lobby and out onto the street, and she was 3 blocks from the building before she stopped walking. Not because she wanted to stop, but because her body made the decision. And she stood on the sidewalk with her hand against a concrete wall and breathed through it. The cold anger was still there. It was going to be there for a long time. But underneath it, fragmentary and unwanted and completely against her will, she kept seeing his face when he'd said I would never have had a chance to know her. The specific look of it, not the practiced control, the thing under the practiced control. She pushed herself off the wall and kept walking. She called the Maple Leaf Center when she got home. She arranged for extended hours pickup. She sat Nia down after dinner, Nia who was eating yogurt with focused intensity and periodic commentary about the spoon, and watched her daughter for a long moment. Nia looked up. What, Mama? Nothing, baby, Amara said. Eat your yogurt. Spoon, Nia confirmed and returned to her work. Amara had her resignation letter done by 9 p.m. She was halfway through her third revision of it, not because the content was wrong, but because she kept stopping and looking at the wall and then coming back to it, when her phone lit up. Not Tae-hyun's number, Ha-jun's. She almost didn't answer. Then she did. Ms. Brooks. Ha-jun's voice was tight in a way that was different from his usual professional tension. This was something operational. I apologize for calling. Mr. Kang asked that I reach you. He said, a pause like he was reading from something or choosing words carefully. He said to tell you it isn't safe to finalize anything tonight. She felt the back of her neck go cold. What does that mean? There's been a development. Another pause. In the building. Chaewon is handling it, but Mr. Kong thought you should know not to. He said to be careful tonight, to make sure the locks are secure. Ha-jun. Her voice was very flat now. What development? He hesitated for long enough that she knew he was deciding how much she was supposed to know. There was a man on the building's perimeter this evening, with a camera that was focused on the executive entrance. He's been identified as associated with Jang Seok-jin's organization. She knew the name. She'd seen it in documents, not often, and never attached to anything specific, but the name recurred in financial contexts that didn't quite resolve, the kind of recurring thread you noted and kept separate for later. And what does that have to do with me? Ha-jun was quiet. Ha-jun? The camera wasn't focused on Mr. Kang, he said carefully. It was focused on the entrance you typically use, the one near the parking structure. She stood up from the table. Your vehicle has been documented, he said. And your daughter's school pickup location was... He stopped. Chaewon says this is surveillance, not action, at this stage. But Mr. Kang... Tell Mr. Kang, she said, and her voice was doing the thing again, the cold, steady thing that wasn't the same as being calm, but served the same external purpose. That my safety is not his concern, and my daughter's safety is mine to manage. She hung up. She stood in her kitchen for a moment. Then she walked to the front door and checked the deadbolt. She went to Nia's room and looked at her sleeping daughter and stood there for longer than she should have. She went to the window and looked down at the street below. The ordinary night street, a couple walking a dog, a convenience store with its light going, a taxi pulling in to let someone out. Nothing unusual. That was not the same as nothing wrong. She went back to the kitchen table and looked at her half-written resignation letter, Jang Seok-jin's organization. She pulled up what she had, the fragments from documents, the contextual references, the inferences she'd built up over 7 weeks of reading things between the lines. Seok-jin was not a name attached to anything as clean as corporate competition. The shape of what she could assemble about his operation was the shape of a man who didn't stop at professional damage when he decided to dismantle something. And his people had been watching the entrance she used, had documented her vehicle, knew which parking structure she came out of. She stared at the resignation letter. If she left now, walked away from KTH, from Tae-hyun's network, from the protection that came with that association whether she'd chosen it or not, she became a private citizen in Seoul with a 2-year-old and no institutional backing, and a knowledge base that Jang Seok-jin apparently considered significant enough to surveil. If she stayed, she remained inside a situation built on a foundation that Tae-hyun had constructed without her knowledge or consent, working for a man who had manipulated her into proximity with him for reasons she understood now but couldn't forgive yet. She looked at the resignation letter. Then she looked at the door to Nia's room. She was still sitting at the table at 11:30 when her phone lit up again. Not Ha-jun this time. Not a number she recognized at all. A string of digits that didn't match any format she knew. And she almost let it go to voicemail, and then something made her answer. Ms. Brooks? A man's voice. Korean accent. Educated, with the specific smoothness of someone who practiced how they sounded. Please don't hang up. I'm not calling to frighten you. She said nothing. My name isn't important right now, the voice said. What's important is that you understand the situation you're in more fully than you currently do. I think Kang Tae-hyun has been selective about what he's told you. A small pause. We have information about your daughter, about how the fertility clinic records were accessed, about who else may have been involved in the original arrangement. The voice stayed smooth, patient. We'd like to discuss this with you, not as a threat, as people who share a common interest in understanding the truth. Her hand was very tight on the phone. That's a sophisticated way to describe a surveillance operation on a parking garage, she said. A pause on his end. Surprise maybe, or recalibration. You're well informed. I'm a financial analyst, she said. It's the job. Then you'll understand, the voice said, that what Kang Tae-hyun stores in the directories on his 49th floor is only the version of the truth he wants you to have. Something shifted in his tone. Still smooth, but with an edge appearing underneath it, the edge of something that had been waiting. There are documents he didn't put in that folder, Ms. Brooks. Documents about the clinic, about the donation program, about whether the anonymous nature of the arrangement was as accidental as he led you to believe. She sat very still. We can show you, the voice said, if you're willing to meet. The kitchen was quiet. Nia made a small sound from her room, the sleep narrating sound, the private language, and then went quiet again. Amara looked at the resignation letter. She looked at the door to her daughter's room. I'll need a location, she said, and the words tasted like stepping off something she couldn't step back onto. And I'll need it in writing, and if I even suspect for 1 second that this is... Of course, the voice said, and something in it shifted to satisfaction, the satisfaction of a man who has spent time setting something up and has just watched it click into place. She hung up before he could say anything else. She sat at the kitchen table for 45 seconds. She counted them. Then she picked up her phone again and called the one number she didn't want to call, and it rang twice before he answered, and he answered like a man who had not been asleep, which told her something. Don't go, Tae-hyun said. No greeting, just that. She went very still. How? Because it's what he does. His voice was different on the phone than in person. Stripped of the room, of the physical weight of him, it was just the voice, and the voice was tighter than she'd heard it. He finds a pressure point, and he applies information like a lever. Whatever he told you about the clinic. Was it true? She said. A silence. Was it true? She said again, and her voice did not shake. She would not let it shake, but it was a near thing. Not the way he'll frame it, Tae-hyun said. Amara, listen to me. Don't meet him. Don't go anywhere tonight. I need you to stay in your apartment with the locks engaged, and you don't get to need things from me right now, she said. Not tonight. Not after what I found in that folder. Another silence. Longer. I know, he said. Tell me what he knows about the clinic that you haven't told me. The pause that followed was the kind that had weight to it. The kind where she could almost hear him calculating. Not whether to lie, she didn't think he was going to lie, but how much truth to give and in what order and what it would cost him. The data irregularity, he said finally. When the clinic flagged it, I told you a doctor mentioned it during a follow-up. That's true. What I didn't tell you is that by the time I began looking into it, Seokjin's organization had already accessed the same records. They found the connection between my stored material and the donor program before I did. He stopped. They've known about Nia longer than I have. The kitchen was very cold suddenly, or she was. She couldn't tell which. How long? She said. 8 months before I found you, he said. She put her hand flat on the table, pressed it down hard. They knew about my daughter for 8 months, and you... I found you first, he said. Whatever else you think about how I handled this, I found you first, and I put you inside a structure that has kept you both safe without you knowing you needed it to. She wanted to throw the phone. She wanted to say something that would crack through the controlled surface of his voice and find whatever was underneath. She wanted about 14 things simultaneously, and none of them were useful, so she held onto the table and breathed. I'm not the threat, he said. Quiet. Direct. The way he said everything that mattered. Seokjin is, and he just called you. She looked at the door to Nia's room. What does he want with her? She said. Leverage, Tae-hyun said. One word. Final as a door closing. Over me. She sat with that. Stay in the apartment, he said again. Jaewon is already... Don't, she said. Don't tell me Jaewon is already something. Don't manage this around me. She pulled in a breath. Let it out. I'm not going to meet him, but we need to talk. Tomorrow. Everything. No more selected truths. A pause. Yes, and Tae-hyun. She said his name deliberately, the way he'd said hers. If there is one more thing in a folder somewhere that I find before you tell me, we're done. Whatever this is, done. Understood, he said. She hung up. She did not sleep. She sat in the chair nearest Nia's door until the light outside the window shifted from black to the specific blue-gray that came just before dawn. And then she made coffee and drank it standing up and watched Seoul rebuild itself out of the dark, tower by tower, bridge by bridge, the river going silver and then gold as the sun found its angle. At 6:15, Nia woke up and patted out in her pajamas with her hair doing something ambitious and Bunbun trailing from one hand, and she looked at Amara with her big dark eyes. Those eyes that Amara had spent 2 years not asking about, not wondering about, or telling herself she wasn't, and said, "Mama didn't sleep." "Mama's okay," Amara said, for the second time in 12 hours. Nia considered this, then she held up Bunbun. Bunbun didn't sleep too. "No?" "Worried," Nia said gravely. Amara crouched down and pressed her forehead against her daughter's and held it there for a moment. Nia smelled like sleep and the lavender shampoo, and something that was just specifically Nia, that specific warm smell that Amara had memorized without trying. "It's going to be okay," she said, and this time she was saying it to herself as much as to either of them. She believed it approximately 40%. The meeting with Tae-hyun happened at 8, before the floor populated, in the office with the door closed. She told him everything, the phone call, the exact words, the location the voice had texted afterward, a warehouse address in Incheon she'd had the presence of mind to screenshot before deleting the message. She told it without editorializing, and he listened without interrupting, which she was beginning to understand was how he processed serious things. In complete silence, taking it in, nothing leaving his face, but everything going somewhere behind his eyes. When she finished, he looked at the address she'd written down. "He wanted you to come alone," he said. "Yes." "And he wanted you frightened enough to think you needed what he was offering." "Yes." Taehyun looked at the address for another moment. Then he said, "He's accelerating, more to himself than to her. He's moving earlier than—" He stopped. "Earlier than what?" she said. He looked up, made a decision she could see him make. "He's been positioning for 3 months. Board members, 2 of mine have been in contact with his people. I have confirmation on 1, strong indication on the 2nd. He's been buying debt on 3 of our subsidiary holdings through intermediaries, and now he's coming directly at personal leverage." He put the paper down. "He's not waiting for a financial play. He wants the whole organization, and he wants it fast." She looked at him. "What does that mean for us?" He heard the us. She saw him hear it. He didn't react to it, except that he looked at her differently for a fraction of a second. Not with hope, exactly, more with the particular attention of a man who has learned to be careful with things he doesn't want to break. "It means," he said, "that what happens in the next 72 hours determines whether there's an organization left to have this conversation in." She nodded, once. "Then tell me what you need from me." The next 40 hours were the kind that stripped everything down to function. Amara worked without stopping in any meaningful way. 3 hours of sleep the first night, 2 the second, coffee, and the specific cold clarity that came when the body ran out of the luxury of anxiety and shifted into something more mechanical. She was pulling financial records, cross-referencing transactions, building a paper trail through the subsidiary structures that Seokjin's people had been using to quietly acquire leverage. She was good at this. This was the thing she was specifically, demonstrably good at, and she leaned into it the way you lean into the one solid surface in a room that's moving. Jaewon came to her desk on the second morning and stood there for a moment without speaking, which from him was practically a declaration of goodwill. "The Incheon location," he said. "We sent people." She looked up. "And Seokjin wasn't there, stager operation, someone else in the room. Someone who would have recorded the conversation and walked you through questions designed to get you to say specific things on tape." He paused. "Things that could be edited to look like you were confirming operational details to an outside party." She sat with that. "He was going to manufacture evidence that I was feeding information to a competitor." "Yes." "And use it against both of you," Chaewon said. "You lose your freedom. He loses credibility in an ongoing legal challenge to one of the subsidiary acquisitions. He looked at her steadily, the look of a man revising something. You didn't go. No, she said. Something shifted in his face, not warmth, something more like the correction of a previous assessment. He nodded once and left. She turned back to her screen. At 11 that night, Naya spiked a fever. Amara was in the building when the Maple Leaf Center called. Late pickup. She'd arranged extended hours. The teacher's voice was apologetic and worried in equal measure. Nia had been fussy all day, not eating, and now her temperature was 103.1 and climbing, and she was asking for Mama with an increasing urgency that the teacher conveyed with genuine sympathy. Amara was in the car in 4 minutes. She didn't tell anyone she was leaving. She just left. Nia was in the small room off the main care area, sitting on a cot with a damp cloth on her forehead that she kept removing, wrapped in her outdoor jacket because she'd said she was cold, holding Bun Bun against her chest with the grip of someone who needed an anchor. When she saw Amara, she made a sound that wasn't quite a word, just a sound. The specific sound of a child who has been holding on and can now stop holding on. I'm here, Amara said, and picked her up, all of her, coat and rabbit, and the damp cloth that fell to the floor. I'm here, baby. Mama's here. Cold, Nia said into her shoulder. I know. We're going to the doctor. Don't want doctor. I know. Want... Nia stopped, pressed her face harder into Amara's shoulder, said something that came out muffled and that Amara couldn't quite catch. What, baby? Want daddy, Nia said, small and exhausted and completely without guile, the way children asked for things they needed, without apology or complexity, just the need, clean and direct. Amara closed her eyes for a second. Okay, she said. She didn't know why she said it. She said it anyway. The hospital was 20 minutes away. Amara was in the back seat with Nia in her lap. She knew this wasn't the safest position, but Nia was shaking slightly with the fever and needed the contact when her phone buzzed. A text from Tae-hyun. Simple. Where are you? Not a question, not a demand, just those 3 words, and she understood from the context that Jae-won or someone had told him she'd left the building. She typed back the hospital name. 12 minutes later, as the taxi was pulling up to the emergency entrance, another text. I'm coming. She didn't respond. She got Nia inside, got her registered, got her into a room, and onto the bed, sat on the edge of it with her daughter's hand in hers while the intake nurse took temperature and blood pressure and asked about symptoms with the efficient kindness of someone who had done this 10,000 times. Pneumonia risk, the nurse said, from the congestion combined with the fever level. They'd want a chest x-ray. They'd want to keep her for observation. Amara sat in the plastic chair beside the bed and held Nia's hand and watched her daughter sleep in the fitful way of a feverish child and did not look at the door of the room. He arrived 40 minutes later. She heard him before she saw him. Not his footsteps, she hadn't learned those yet, but the quality of the change in the corridor outside, the way a hallway sounds different when someone is moving through it with purpose and has security with them. Then the door opened and he came in. He was still in his work clothes. No jacket. He looked like a man who had been in the middle of something and stopped being in the middle of it without any transition time. He looked at Nia first. Just looked at her. The sleeping child in the hospital bed with the monitors and the IV they'd gotten started and Bun Bun tucked under her arm. And his face did the thing she'd seen twice before. The thing that wasn't controlled. The thing that came from somewhere his discipline hadn't managed to reach. Then he looked at Amara. She looked back. She was too tired for anything complicated. She was so tired that the anger had gone down to embers, and what was left was just the truth of the room. The sick child, the plastic chair, the 40 hours of no sleep, and the man standing in the doorway looking at her daughter like she was the most serious thing he'd ever seen. Sit down, she said, tiredly. You came all this way. He sat in the chair on the other side of the bed. They sat like that for a long time without speaking. Nia's breathing evened out. The monitors kept their sounds. Outside the room, the hospital moved around them. At some point, Tae-hyun reached out and adjusted the blanket that had slipped off Nia's shoulder. Just that. A small adjustment. Careful, like doing it wrong would break something. Amara watched him do it. She thought about the 12 documents in the folder. She thought about the phone call from Seok-jin's man in the staged warehouse in Incheon, and Jaewon's face doing the thing of revising an assessment. She thought about the sewing kit on her desk and the coffee made exactly the way she took it without being asked. She thought about a man in a German hospital at 33 who had made a decision about genetic material because he was being told to prepare for an outcome he didn't survive. And she thought about what it cost to store something for a future you weren't sure you were going to have. She didn't forgive him, not yet. That was going to take longer and would require different conditions than a hospital room at midnight. But she looked at him across the bed where her daughter was sleeping, and she said quietly, "The chest x-ray came back, early pneumonia. They want to keep her 2 days." He nodded. "They say she'll be okay." He nodded again. His jaw was tight, not with the controlled professional tightness, with something else. "Taehyun," she said. He looked at her. "The subsidiary files I've been building, the transaction trail." She kept her voice low, steady, the working voice. "I found a third board member. Not 2, 3. She watched his eyes shift into the operational register, the calculation beginning. "And there's a fourth entity in the acquisition chain that isn't one of Seok-jin's known vehicles. It's cleaner than the others, better structured." She looked at him. "I think it's someone inside your organization." The silence that followed was the heaviest kind. "Show me," he said. She pulled out her phone. She had photographed the relevant portions of the documents before leaving. Habit, or instinct, or the specific paranoia that 40 hours without sleep produced in a person whose trust had recently been systematically dismantled and rebuilt into an unfamiliar shape. She handed him the phone. He looked at it for a long time. His face had gone completely still in the way it did when something was serious, the professional mask. But underneath it, something was happening that she could see in the very slight tension around his eyes. "Hajun," he said, very quietly. She had not said a name. The documents hadn't contained a name. He had gotten there from the financial structure alone, and the speed with which he'd gotten there told her the suspicion wasn't new. "You already knew," she said. "I suspected." He handed the phone back. His hand was steady. Everything about him was outwardly steady. "I didn't want it to be him." She looked at him. The man who had survived cancer and assassination attempts and a government investigation and had now just confirmed that someone who had been beside him for years had been feeding information to the man trying to destroy everything he'd built. She watched him hold that. She watched him not fall apart. She thought about what it cost to be the person who couldn't fall apart. "What do we do?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. On the bed, Nia made a small sound and resettled, pulling Bunbun closer. "We use it," Taehyun said. His voice had gone to a register she hadn't heard before. Not the executive voice, not the controlled social voice, something underneath those. Harder. Older. The voice of someone who had learned very early that survival required the ability to convert every wound into a weapon. "Hajun doesn't know we know, which means we control what he reports back." He looked at Naya, then back at Amara. "And I know exactly where Seok-jin will be in 36 hours. He has a meeting, a financial closing, a property acquisition he's been building toward for 2 years. He'll be at the Incheon port facility." His eyes were very steady. "He won't miss it. It's too important to him." Amara understood what he was saying. "You want to take it to him?" she said. "I want to end it," he said. "Simple. Absolute. For good." She looked at her daughter sleeping. The monitors, the IV, the stuffed rabbit with the restitched ear. She thought about Seok-jin's man on the phone saying, "There are documents he didn't put in that folder." She thought about what it meant that they had known about Nia for 8 months before Taehyun had found her. 8 months in which her daughter had been a piece on a board she hadn't known she was standing on. She thought about all of that, and she felt something settle in her chest. Not peace, not yet, but something like resolution. The moment when a decision stops being a decision and becomes the only available direction. "I can finish the financial evidence package," she said. "If you get me the Incheon corporate registration files, the ones in the restricted directory, you'll have them in an hour. Then by the time you move on the port facility, we'll have a package complete enough that any prosecutor with functioning eyes can follow it straight to his entire network." He looked at her. A long look. The kind that was taking inventory. "You don't have to be part of this," he said. The dangerous part. You can stay here with Nia and I know I don't have to, she said. I'm telling you what I'm going to do. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the room, the hospital kept its sounds. Inside, Nia breathed. The monitors beeped their soft, rhythmic confirmation that her heart was working and her lungs were working and she was still there. Tae-hyun looked at his daughter, sleeping. Something crossed his face that Amara would think about later. In the days after, in the quiet that followed the storm, something that was grief and gratitude and the specific anguish of a man who understands, for the first time clearly, exactly how much he has to lose. Then he looked up at Amara, and she saw the decision land in him. Not made in that moment, she thought, but confirmed, the way decisions that have been forming for a long time sometimes need a single moment to become real. 36 hours, he said. 36 hours, she agreed. And in the basement of the port facility in Incheon, 30 miles away, in a room that smelled like salt water and rust and old money, Jang Sok-jin sat across from the man Amara would have recognized as Ha-jun if she'd been there to see it, and listened to Ha-jun say that Kang Tae-hyun had not yet identified the leak, that the woman was isolated and frightened, that everything was still on track. Ha-jun was wrong about that. He had been wrong for 11 hours by the time the black cars pulled up to the Incheon port facility at 2:17 in the morning, and he would not understand how wrong until the moment the lights came on inside the building, and he saw, through the window of the room where Seok-jin was still sitting with his hands folded on the table, that the men coming through the doors were not the ones he'd been told would come. But that was later. First, there was the work. Amara finished the evidence package at midnight in the hospital room while Nia slept. She worked on her laptop with the screen brightness turned down low, the documents Tae-hyun had gotten her spread across 3 windows, and she built the case the way she built every financial case. Layer by layer, each connection sourced and documented, each inference supported by at least 2 independent data points. Nothing asserted that couldn't be demonstrated. The transaction trail through Seok-jin's acquisition vehicles. The board member communications, 3 of them now, time-stamped and cross-referenced. The property holdings that connected the port facility to a series of shell entities she'd tracked through 4 jurisdictions in 2 weeks of work that she'd originally been doing for completely different reasons. And at the center of it, clean and inevitable as a mathematical proof, Ha-jun. His name appeared 7 times in the documentation, never directly, always through the financial structures he'd used. Accounts connected to a consulting entity registered in his mother's maiden name, communication timing that aligned precisely with strategic decisions that had benefited Seok-jin's acquisition timeline. A transfer made 3 months ago from an account she could trace to an account she could prove. She packaged it, encrypted it, sent it to 2 addresses. One she'd been given by Tae-hyun, one she'd chosen herself, a contact at a financial crimes division she'd cultivated carefully over 2 years of working in Seoul, a woman named Inspector Lim, who answered her email at 12:45 in the morning because apparently financial crimes inspectors also didn't sleep. Inspector Lim's response was 4 words. Send me the rest. Amara sent her the rest. At 1 in the morning, she closed her laptop and looked at Nia for a while. The fever had come down to 101. The nurse who checked at midnight had said this was good, said the antibiotics were working, said she's a strong little one in the way medical professionals said things that were meant to be reassuring, and managed to be both reassuring and terrifying simultaneously. Nia's face in sleep was calm now. The distress of the earlier hours had ironed out. She looked like herself. Amara sat in the plastic chair and looked at her daughter and thought about everything that had led to this room. Not just the last 72 hours, not just the 7 weeks on the 49th floor, but further back. The decision she'd made at 29, the forms she'd signed, the version of herself who had sat in a clinic in Germany and chosen a future without fully understanding what she was choosing into. She thought about that woman without judgment. That woman had done the best she could with what she had, which was all anyone ever did, and the outcome of what she'd done was sleeping in a hospital bed with a rabbit under her arm, and whatever else was true, Amara could not find it in herself to wish for a different outcome. Tae-hyun came back at 1:15. He'd been gone 2 hours. He came in quietly, checked Nia's monitors without being asked. He'd learned what they meant, she realized, had probably looked it up in the gap, because that was how he operated, absorbing necessary information without announcing that he was doing it, and then sat in the chair across from her. It's done, he said. She looked at him. He looked like a man who had passed through something. Still intact, still controlled on the surface, but the surface was thinner than usual. She could see the cost of the last few days in the way he held his shoulders, the slight deepening around his eyes. Hajun, she said. K1 handled it. A pause. He's in custody. He'll be transferred to authorities in the morning, along with everything you sent Inspector Lim. She'd known he would have people watching her communications. She found she didn't mind. And Seok Jin, arrested at 2:17 at the Incheon facility. His legal team is already moving, but the documentation you built... He stopped, looked at his hands for a moment. It's comprehensive. Inspector Lim used the word airtight, which she apparently never uses. Amara looked at him. Is it over? The immediate threat, he said. Yes. He looked up. The rest takes time. The board members who were compromised, the subsidiary structure that needs rebuilding, the legal proceedings. He was quiet for a moment. None of that is tonight. She nodded. They sat in silence for a while. Nia breathed. The monitors kept their rhythm. Outside the window of the room, the Seoul night was doing what it always did. Going on, indifferent and enormous. The city that didn't stop for personal reckonings. Hajun, she said again. Not asking about the logistics this time. Taehyun understood the difference. 6 years, he said, quiet, almost flat. He's been with me 6 years. I'm sorry, she said. He looked at her. The look of a man who hadn't expected that from her. Not tonight, not after everything. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. She held his gaze. I'm saying it because it's true. Betrayal from someone that close. She stopped. It's a different kind of damage. He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was lower. When I was in the hospital in Germany, during treatment, he was the only person from my organization who came. He looked at Nia. He flew to Frankfurt, and he sat with me for 3 days because I had told everyone else it wasn't necessary. A pause. I thought I knew what loyalty looked like. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that would fix the specific wound of discovering that a thing you trusted was a different shape than you'd believed it to be. She knew that particular geography herself now. She sat with him in the room where their daughter was sleeping and let the silence be what it was. After a while, Nia made a sound, a small, directive sound. They both looked at her. Nia's eyes were open, not fully awake, the half-consciousness of a feverish child in the middle of the night, but open, looking at the ceiling with an expression of mild complaint. Then she turned her head, and she saw them, both of them, sitting on either side of her in the dark, watching her. She looked at Amara. Then she looked at Taehyun. Both here, she said. Not a question, a fact she was confirming. Both here, Amara said. Nia looked at the ceiling again, processed this information. Then she said, okay, with the finality of someone who has verified what they needed to verify and can now return to sleep, which is exactly what she did, pulling Bun Bun tighter and closing her eyes and going back under with the completeness that only small children and the very exhausted managed. Amara looked up. Taehyun was looking at her. She looked back. Something passed between them in that moment that wasn't any of the things that had passed between them before. Not the professional assessment, not the careful negotiation, not the anger or the justification or the calculated giving of partial truths. This was simpler than all of that. This was two people in a room with a sleeping child, both of them frayed down to something real, and the something real was looking at the other person and not looking away. She looked away first, at Nia. We have things to figure out, she said. Yes. About her. About what we tell her and when, about what... She stopped. Started again. About what you are to her, what you're allowed to be. I know, he said. I'm not ready to have those conversations yet. I know, he said again. She looked at him. But I'm not leaving, not because of what Seokjin's people were going to do, not because of security, because... She stopped. This was the hard part, the honest part. Because she wants both here. And I think she's been right about things I didn't give her credit for. He didn't say anything for a moment. When he did, his voice was different, stripped of everything except what it actually was. I will spend the rest of my life making the beginning of this right. I know what I did with the clinic records, with the manipulation of the proximity. I know what it cost you. You don't fully know yet, she said, but you will, because we're going to keep talking about it until you do. Something happened in his face. Not a smile, not exactly, but something in the same territory. Something that acknowledged, without performing itself, that he understood what she was offering, which was not forgiveness yet, but the possibility of it. The willingness to stay in the room long enough to find out. Okay, he said. The same word Naya had used. Same register. Final and simple. Amara turned back to her daughter. Get some sleep, she said. There's a chair by the window. It's not comfortable, but it's there. He got up, moved to the chair by the window, sat down. She heard him settle, heard the particular quiet of a person making themselves still in an uncomfortable place and committing to it. She looked at Nia one more time. Then she closed her eyes. She was asleep in 4 minutes, which was the fastest she'd fallen asleep in 7 weeks. Nia was discharged 2 days later on a Tuesday morning with a prescription and a follow-up appointment and a small sticker of a cartoon sun that the discharge nurse pressed to her hand as they were leaving. Nia examined the sticker with the gravity it deserved, and then affixed it carefully to Bunbun's repaired ear. Better, she decided. Much better, Taehyun confirmed from her other side. They walked out of the hospital into the late October morning. Pale sunlight, the first real chill of autumn sitting in the air. Seoul going about its business around them with complete indifference to the fact that the past 72 hours had happened at all. The city was good at that. It absorbed everything. Amara squinted in the light. She felt like someone who had been turned inside out and put back together slightly differently than before. Not worse, not yet sure if better, just different, reordered. Taehyun was carrying Nia because Nia had decreed this was the arrangement from the moment they'd left the room, reaching for him with the same absolute confidence she'd had since the first day, the reach that didn't anticipate refusal. He held her like someone who had practiced this in his mind for longer than he'd admitted to anyone. They stood on the hospital steps for a moment. Nia was telling Taehyun about Bunbun's sticker in significant detail. He was listening with his full attention, which was, Amara had come to understand, the only way he did anything, full attention or not at all. She watched them. She thought about a woman at 29, signing forms in a clinic in Germany, believing she understood exactly what she was doing. She thought about a man at 33 in a hospital bed, not so different from the one they'd just left, making a decision for a future he wasn't sure he'd reach. She thought about the distance between those two moments and this one. The sidewalk, the October light, the child explaining the medicinal properties of cartoon sun stickers. And the distance was vast and completely invisible, the way the distance always was between the choices and the life that grew out of them. She didn't believe things happened for reasons. She didn't believe in systems that arranged outcomes. She believed in the specific, unglamorous causality of decisions and consequences and the occasional mercy of circumstances aligning in ways you hadn't planned. This was one of those. She hadn't planned it. She hadn't chosen it. It was true anyway. Over the following weeks, things moved the way things moved after crises. Not cleanly, not neatly, but with the grinding, incremental progress of institutions doing what they were built to do. Inspector Lim's team worked through the documentation Amar had built and found it, as promised, comprehensive. Seok Jin's legal team was good, the best money could assemble, but good legal teams worked with evidence and the evidence was what it was. The board members who'd been compromised resigned quietly, under terms negotiated through attorneys who never used direct language for anything. The subsidiary structure was rebuilt over 3 months, with Amara involved in the restructuring from the beginning, not as an assistant, but as a principal. Her terms, negotiated directly, in a meeting where she sat across from Taehyun and his remaining senior staff and said what she needed and waited without apology for what she got. She got most of it. What she didn't get, she went back for. Hajun's trial was brief. He didn't contest the financial evidence. He sat in the courtroom and didn't look at Taehyun, which Amara thought was either mercy or cowardice or both. He was sentenced in March. Taehyun was not in the courtroom for the sentencing. He was in a board meeting that had been scheduled for that day specifically, she thought. Not because he didn't want to see it, but because seeing it wouldn't have given him anything he needed. He'd already paid the cost of it. The sentencing was just paperwork. She thought about asking him about it, decided not to. Some things were better left in the room where they'd been processed. Nia recovered fully from the pneumonia, which the doctors said was unremarkable, and which felt to everyone who had sat in that hospital room like nothing unremarkable about it. She went back to Maple Leaf Center the following Monday with Bun Bun and the cartoon sun sticker, which had been relocated from the rabbit's ear to a position of honor on the front of Nia's water bottle. She told her teachers she'd been sick but was better now. She told them she had a daddy. This information was delivered with the same calm certainty she'd been deploying since the beginning, as if it had always been true and everyone else had just needed time to catch up. The teachers, sensibly, said that was wonderful. Taehyun was in Nia's life the way water was in soil. Present, absorb, not announced. He learned her schedules. He learned which books she'd have read twice, and which she was still working through, and which ones she threw across the room because the ending wasn't to her satisfaction. He learned that she ate her rice in a specific counterclockwise pattern before she'd eat anything else on the plate, and that this was non-negotiable. He learned that Bun Bun was not a toy, but a person, and required corresponding treatment. He sat on the floor of Amara's apartment on a Saturday morning in November with stacking blocks and a child who was absolutely certain he was building the tower wrong and corrected him without mercy, and he took the corrections and rebuilt the tower. And when Nia knocked it over with the gleeful violence of a toddler at peak entertainment, he laughed. A real laugh, short and surprised, like something that had gotten out before he could decide whether to let it. And Amara heard it from the kitchen and stood still for a moment with her coffee and didn't say anything. She and Taehyun had conversations across those months that went places she hadn't expected. Not about the clinic. They had that conversation fully in October, one evening after Nia was asleep, and it was long and hard and in some sections unbearable, and they had it anyway, all of it, until the parts that needed to be said had been said, and the room felt different after, exhausted and aired out like a space that had needed the window open for a long time. Other conversations. About who they were, separately, before all of this. About what it meant to have survived things that were supposed to be unsurvivable. About the specific loneliness of being very good at keeping walls up, and what happened to people who did it long enough that they forgot the walls were there. He told her about Frankfurt, about 6 months of chemotherapy in a hospital where he knew no one, and had instructed his organization to treat his absence as temporary, and had been, in the nights when the treatment was worst, completely and absolutely alone with the possibility of his own end. He told it without drama, without asking for anything from it, just the facts of it. She listened without interrupting. She told him about the years before Naya, the relationship that had ended 2 months before she'd moved to Seoul, the one that had convinced her, finally, that the future she wanted wasn't going to arrive the way she'd expected it to, and the decision that had followed. She hadn't told anyone in Korea about this. She told him. He listened without interrupting. These conversations happened in increments, over weeks, the way trust rebuilt itself after being damaged. Not in dramatic single gestures, but in accumulated small ones, each one a choice, each choice making the next one slightly easier until the ease itself became a kind of answer. She didn't rush it. She didn't let him rush it. When he moved too fast, and sometimes he did, the impatience of a man who had identified what he wanted and had limited practice deferring. She said so clearly, without softening it, and he stopped. He didn't always stop gracefully, but he stopped. She respected that. In February, on a Thursday evening, he came to her apartment for dinner, which had become a twice-a-week arrangement that Nia had instituted by simply assuming it was policy. Amara had made a version of her mother's jollof rice, adapted with what she could get at the market, and Nia had helped in the way toddlers helped with cooking, which was enthusiastic interference, and the rice was slightly oversalted because of a moment of toddler-facilitated distraction. Taehyun ate 2 full portions. After dinner, after Nia was asleep, they sat at the kitchen table with the last of the wine and the quiet of the apartment around them, and talked about nothing particularly important for a while. A project in the restructured subsidiary portfolio she'd been consulting on, a book he'd finished, something Nia had said at pickup that week that had made the teacher cry laugh. And Amara thought, not for the first time, but more clearly than before, that this was what it looked like when walls came down. Not the dramatic removal, the slow erosion, the finding of a person on the other side who was different from the structure you'd been negotiating with, and more complicated, and, in the ways that mattered, more worth the time. He left at 10:30, At the door, he turned and looked at her for a moment. The way he sometimes did, inventory, she'd come to understand, was how he expressed things he wasn't yet ready to put into words. She looked back. "Same time Thursday," she said. "Yes," he said. He left. She stood at the closed door for a moment, then went to check on Naya. Her daughter was asleep on her stomach in the flying position, arms out, face turned to the side, Bun under one outflung arm. The nightlight made the room amber. Everything was quiet. Amara sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her for a while. She thought about the morning in October when she'd stood in her dark kitchen in an ironed blouse with cold coffee, and the phone had rung and the day she'd planned had become something else entirely. She thought about the elevator closing on a small dark head and a floppy ear. She thought about a silence in an enormous office and a child's clear voice in the middle of it. Daddy. She'd spent months now trying to understand how Nia had known. She'd framed it as instinct, as accident, as the random linguistic confidence of a 2-year-old who applied the word to men without discrimination. Some of this was true. Maybe all of it was true. Or maybe, and she allowed herself this just once in the quiet of her daughter's room, maybe there was something that didn't have a clean name for it, some recognition that moved between people before reason could intervene. And her daughter, unencumbered by the defenses that adults built between themselves and accurate perception, had simply seen what was true and said it. She would never know. That was fine. The truth didn't require her to understand its mechanism. It just required her to be present for it. She tucked the blanket up over Nia's shoulder, pressed a kiss to her daughter's hair, stood up. 1 year after the night in the Incheonport facility, Taehyun took them to his family's estate outside the city, a traditional structure on the edge of a hillside, old wood and stone, a garden that had been maintained by people who understood what maintenance across generations actually meant. He'd had it opened for the evening. Paper lanterns were lit through the garden, small gold lights through the October dark. The kind of illumination that didn't compete with the night, but sat inside it. Nia ran ahead of them down the stone path because Nia always ran ahead, fearless and directive, narrating the lanterns to Bun with the authority of an expedition leader. Amara walked beside Taehyun. The garden was quiet, except for Nia's commentary in the distance, and the sound of the wind in the trees on the hillside. Seoul was somewhere beyond the dark, its light a pale glow on the horizon, the city that had held all of this. The fear and the manipulation and the hospital rooms and the hours at keyboards in the middle of the night, without caring, without stopping, just going on the way cities do. She liked it for that, she thought. The not stopping. He stopped walking. She stopped. He turned to face her, and she turned to face him, and the lantern light moved between them in the way light moved when there was wind. Not steady, not guaranteed, but present. He reached into his jacket pocket. He held out his hand. In his palm was a ring. Simple, old, a dark stone set in plain metal, the kind of thing that had been worn before and carried weight from it. "My mother's," he said. She looked at it, then at him. His face was open, was the word. Stripped of everything she'd spent a year learning to see through. Just the man, undefended, holding something that mattered in a way she could read clearly. "I'm not the same person I was a year ago," he said. "You're the reason for some of that. Nia is the reason for the rest." A pause. He didn't look away from her. "I don't have a version of the future I want that doesn't have you in it. Both of you. And I'm done being strategic about things that deserve to be honest." The wind moved the lantern light. Somewhere ahead on the path, Nia was telling Bun about a particularly interesting rock. Amara looked at the ring. She looked at him. She thought about the woman she'd been a year ago, the one who'd ironed her blouse twice and had cold coffee and a plan she understood, the one who had not known she was standing in a room where everything was about to change. She thought about all the ways that woman would have said no to this, would have had good reasons, documented reasons. She thought about Nia running ahead on a lantern-lit path. She thought about a man who had learned late and at significant cost that power was not the same as safety, and that the things worth protecting were not always the things you could build a wall around. She took the ring. She held it in her palm for a moment, feeling its weight. Real weight, old weight, the weight of a thing that had meant something before and was being asked to mean something again. "We keep talking," she said, "about everything. No selected truths, No managed proximity. No decisions about my life or Nia's life made without me in the room. Yes, he said. And you're going to learn to be wrong out loud. Not just confirmed, wrong, where I can see it. Something moved in his face. That's going to be harder. I know, she said. Do it anyway. Yes, he said again. She slid the ring onto her finger. He looked at her hand, then at her face. Yes, she said. From down the path, Nia appeared at a run, having covered the distance back in the time it had taken for something important to happen, arriving between them the way she always did, absolute, certain, demanding of the center of any space she entered. Lanterns, she announced, pointing back at the garden as if they hadn't seen the lanterns, as if the lanterns were specifically her discovery and required their full attention. Tae-hyun crouched down. Show me, he said. Nia grabbed his hand and pointed at Amara, with her other hand in a clear instruction. Both of you, come, the lanterns are waiting. Amara took her daughter's hand. They walked into the lantern-lit garden, the three of them, while the light moved around them and the city glowed somewhere distant, and the night held still, for once, around something that had taken a very long time to become what it was, and had, in the end, become exactly that. Not perfect, not without its costs and its scars and its history of decisions that had been wrong before they became part of something right. Just true. That was enough. That had always been enough. It just took the whole story to find out.